Come home. This has been a popular sentiment used by Blizzard surrounding the upcoming release of World of Warcraft: The War Within, the latest expansion to World of Warcraft. And a lot of what they said about it piqued my curiosity and interest. So much so that I decided to go back to World of Warcraft, at least a little bit. I decided to play a little bit of the free trial, where you can level characters up to level 20. So I did that with a dwarf shaman, and then I immediately lost all interest, and well, why is that? And I think it's for a very simple reason that a lot of other games, especially MMOs, tend to suffer from: difficulty. You see, for a lot of games, especially MMORPGs, the leveling is designed in such a way so that it's kind of easy. And there's nothing inherently wrong with it being easy as a concept. The problem is the degree of how easy it is. And this is especially true for World of Warcraft, where unless you're doing endgame raiding, Mythic Plus, or high-end PvP, you can kind of just grab your hand, smash it on the keyboard a few times, and chances are the combination of buttons you'll press there will be enough to defeat whatever enemy you're fighting shockingly easily. And we hear the excuse time and time again that the game has to be designed this way and this easily for the vast majority of players, and for new players who may not be all that good at the game. And then you peer on over to World of Warcraft Classic, which I would say is mostly a game predicated on existing knowledge, but also patience. And you see how healthy of a player base that game has as well. And throughout most of Classic, the conversation hasn't been surrounding how do we bring people back, it's how do we grow from here. And that's a fundamentally different concept in my opinion, because Classic WoW has an allure to it. It's this adventure, this expedition you embark on, beginning at level 1, all the way to endgame raiding. You have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And at each step of the way, the game provides a unique challenge, but also an experience for you to experience and play through. You have to be cognizant, you have to actually play the game, and if you turn your mind off for too long or in a certain degree or fashion, you can quickly become overwhelmed and then die. But the game, from my experience, and I'm not even someone who played a ton of Classic, but even in my limited experience playing it and then watching it, it's so easy to pick up on this central idea that the idea of Classic is to keep you out in the world on this sense of an adventure, experiencing what's surrounding you and interacting with other people. Not because you have to, but because it's more beneficial to you, the player. I still remember all these years ago from Classic launch when I was in leveling zones in Durotar or the Barrens, and I randomly met up with people and we started to talk. And we did quests together, we grinded mobs together. I still remember moments like that because it's moments like that where MMORPGs shine, where that sense of having an open, interconnected world really comes together into a cohesive whole to bolster the experience and be the actual experience, not a mild detraction or a side project. The problem is, in modern WoW, I've noticed, hey, I don't really have to fight to tag mobs anymore, but I don't have an incentive to even communicate with anyone else because there's no challenge in the open world. And this is a topic of conversation that I think has been so grossly underrepresented and talked about in terms of modern MMOs especially, but also especially for World of Warcraft. Because when the world itself has no bite, you become disinterested. There's a level of disconnection that develops and grows between you and the world that you're playing. 1 to 60, getting to the recent expansion, and even to endgame, becomes a mild distraction instead of an intrinsical part of the experience as a whole. It's an arbitrary time sink that you have to put in, or pay for a boost, instead of feeling like a piece of the game itself. And then when you get to endgame, for a new player at least, you're not learning anything. There's no good pace or rhythm to the game where you're slowly picking up on various mechanics, how the game works, how to play your class, how to play your spec. You're not really going to be picking up on any of that because you don't need to. There's nothing in the game that's really incentivizing you to get better, because each step of the way the game rewards the lowest common denominator in terms of effort and skill. So when you get to the end game and you decide, okay, I'll try some high-end PvP, or I'll try some Mythic Plus, or I'll try some raiding, and then all of a sudden, the game throws a bunch of different mechanics and mechanisms at you, the player, that you're just wholly alienated from, because at no point throughout the game were you ever incentivized to give a crap. Because at no point in the game, outside of maybe that new starting zone they added relatively recently-ish, within the last few years, the game doesn't teach you these things, and they don't teach you these things in a natural environment. Just throwing up a text box and having the player read a wiki or something is not a good tutorial. And no matter how much text boxes you throw at the player, that will not teach the player en masse. You don't develop experience or even a rapport between the game and the mechanics and the player. So when they're all thrown at the player at endgame, well then, they're just not gonna bother to get through that wall because you've made it so insurmountably high instead of creating a gentle slope up to that point. It's a 90-degree cliff instead of a gentle hill. Whereas in Classic, each step of the way, you're learning your mechanics, you're utilizing the tools in your kit to your advantage to interface and interact with the world. You team up with other people because it's far more beneficial to do so. Because you can't just walk up to a mob and hit one key or two and it dies. It's not just a matter of, hey, I get the mob kill now, even though he pulled it. Cool, we are technically working together, aren't we? Because you're not establishing or giving a reason to communicate, so the world feels inherently smaller. There's no strategy, there's no real gameplay happening there. It's just, oh, the mob dies in half a second instead of a full second now. Whoop-de-doo, no one cares. Rare mobs fall over like they're nothing, and at no point does the game provide an incentivizing challenge for you, the player, to, one, learn about, but also overcome. So when it provides that challenge later on, the new player does not have the tools or the experience to be able to handle, but also comprehend what's being thrown at them. And I genuinely do not think that anything Blizzard does will be enough until they rectify this main issue with World of Warcraft. It doesn't feel like a world anymore, because leveling is handled like a glorified loading screen until you get to endgame. And then, you better dang well have the experience or be willing to put in the homework, because Lord knows the game's not going to teach you how to actually interface at the endgame level. And they've tried over the years to find some way to rectify this quandary or this situation. Exile's Reach, the new beginner experience. It's good, but it's not enough, because those underlying issues about the difficulty of the world and not incentivizing the player to get better until you're at max level will always exist. You've tried the training hall, but it's a mild distraction, nothing really more than that. Because the way to properly introduce mechanics and systems and the way the game works, the inherent culture surrounding the game and how you interface with the game, is to do it through the leveling experience and through the gameplay. And when you refuse to give any player a challenge throughout that entire experience, well then all of a sudden, the player disconnects and they don't get better at it. There's no slope teaching the player. And every fix, unless you rectify that root cause, is a band-aid fix that's not addressing the root problem. It's applying makeup to an infection without actually solving it. And a lot of design like this, I'm using World of Warcraft as an example for this, but a lot of other games fall under this main issue as well, is this type of design arises from a sheer distrust and skill of the player. People were good enough to get over this back in 2004, and people are still good enough to get over this in the year 2023 with the rise and prevalence of Classic WoW. I don't and will never buy the argument that 95% of players or so are bad at the game. They're bad at the game because you don't bother to teach them how to play the game. And you don't bother to teach them through the gameplay, through the experience. You don't bother to pace it out throughout the entire experience. To pace out, okay, this is how this mechanic works. And then a few levels, you may do this dungeon, this is how this mechanic works. Oh, hey, you may find some mobs in the open world that are kind of dangerous. Maybe you should party with somebody else to incentivize yourself to take it down. Or you can come back here in a few levels and deal with it that way. For an MMORPG, the RPG elements feel tacked on and unnecessary, whereas the MMO feels more like a suggestion. As if you're going to a zoo and you just see people passing by you. You're not really interacting with them, are you? which is the meat and potatoes of what makes MMOs so good, the interaction. And without that inherent interaction, then everything falls apart around it. And funnily enough, this is one of the elements that I think Final Fantasy XIV tackles better. It still suffers from having a lot of these base experiences be a little bit too easy, but not to the degree of retail WoW. And throughout the game, you're experiencing this Final Fantasy-esque story, this narrative unfolding before you. But it also forces you to do dungeons, to do raids, as they are part of the story. And while they may not be the most challenging thing of all time, you have to at least pay attention for most of them, or at least for some of them. And by doing so, it's not foolproof, they can do a better job at this, but you are slowly teaching people what these mechanics are, teaching the player the language, the culture of the game, how it operates, how it functions. I did not need to go and read up a wiki to find out how to play when I got to max level in Final Fantasy XIV, because the game did a good enough of a job of putting me in situations where I had to learn on my feet. I had to learn from experience. I'm not saying that I could go do an ultimate after that, but like I said, gentle slope. I am above where I was at the start, whereas in WoW, I would be on the same level. And you can have a bit of a jump in difficulty when you get to the end game. You can do that, but you need to give the player enough of a boost going from the leveling where they can reach that wall and then vault over it. Like I said, I don't think Final Fantasy XIV does this the best, but it does a better job at this, in my experience, than retail World of Warcraft. I think there's an argument to be made that Classic WoW does this better than anything, or anyone else, because everything feels like it can be a threat in that game. It's not hard to overcome it, you just have to pay attention. And because you are paying attention, you're in a better position to learn, and to learn how the game operates, how your class or job operates, and what type of mechanics the game will throw at you. It doesn't have to be all at once, but like I said, gentle slope. You are learning over time. And that is the main element that I feel is lacking from a lot of modern day MMOs. And especially retail World of Warcraft. And if they want World of Warcraft to ever really come back into the spotlight, then I don't think the entire game should act as a function to siphon players into one of three camps: high-end PvP, high-end Mythic Plus, or high-end raiding. Because right now, at least to me, it feels like the game exists largely to funnel players into one of those three categories. And they're trying at least to flesh out the open world experience with delves. It's an interesting concept, but they will be undermined, just like Warfronts were, just like Islands were, if they are designed to be beaten by anyone just taking their hand and slapping it on the keyboard a few times. Because that is not engaging gameplay. It doesn't incentivize you to play with others. It doesn't incentivize you to get better at the game. And all it does is end up alienating more and more players as time goes on. And to me, that is the root issue that a lot of MMORPGs need to remedy, especially retail World of Warcraft. Especially going into the World Soul Saga and into the War Within. Because if these new ideas and concepts are going to really work and hook the player, you need to have the game feel like a world and not a loading screen. And with that, I'll call the video there for the day. Thank you all for tuning in. My pleasure for making the video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out and helps support future content, and I greatly appreciate it. Stay safe, have a great day, go play some video games if you can, and as always, I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye, everybody, until we meet again.